American Charter Schools Association, Tony Roberts, congratulations on your recent success in putting the charter schools back in business after that court decision. And I want to say a special word of appreciation to Amber Reichert Young, the author of the first charter school law in America and Minnesota, a longtime friend of mine who really started this whole movement. You know, especially for the younger people here, it is hard for you to imagine, I suppose, in America where there were no charter schools. But in almost 20 years ago, boy, I'm getting old. Almost 20 years ago, I announced my campaign for president. And at the time, America was in a recession, and we were dealing with the first decade of severely increasing income inequality. There was a clear indication in the 1990 census for the very first time that there was a big difference in income earning potential based on the level and quality of education people got. The first time we ever had a serious, clear indication of a gap that great. And I'd spent by then more than a decade trying to improve the schools in my native state of Arkansas. When I became governor, I was greeted with this shocking study that said that kids would be better off in any other public school system in the country than my native state. But when I ran for president, the same person did a survey and said in the previous decade the most improved schools were the schools in Arkansas and South Carolina. So I made the governor of South Carolina the Secretary of Education. And we set about working for 8 years, among other things, to improve the charter schools, to dramatically increase the number of certified master teachers and a lot of other things. But here's what I want to tell you. You know, when you run for office, everybody's got a pollster and all these advisors, and there I was in New Hampshire running 5th in the polls, talking about charter schools when there was one in the whole country in Minnesota. And 2 states, California and Minnesota, had authorized them. I had tabled a bill in Arkansas and had succeeded in passing legislation expanding school choice statewide. I said that parents should have the right to go to any public school if they wanted to. And and there was a big debate because Milwaukee then had adopted a voucher program which was unique to the city of Milwaukee. They had once had a big, thick network of Catholic schools in the city, and a lot of them had moved away as the population of Catholics had changed where they were living. So people were taking over these schools and turning them into private schools. And they had adopted this voucher program. So it was a big fight. The problem I always had with the voucher program is you take, relatively speaking, a lot of money on a few kids, whereas the charter schools spend the same amount of money that the public schools do per child, sometimes even slightly less, never much more. And you deal with the fundamental problem that all institutions have, which is if you have a monopoly on customers and revenues, it undermines your incentive to change. And I had been very sobered up by an experiment that happened in my native state, where I got the Department of Education in the Bush, first President Bush year, to give me a waiver to use Title I money for poor kids, to just put it into the budget in the first couple of years of school and go for smaller classes. We got them down to 15 in this small school district. And to use the kids that were doing really well to actually work with other kids and to make it easier for the teachers. And in this place where we did it, the first graders doubled their performance. The kids that were held back quadrupled their performance. It was an amazing thing. Then I got a waiver to use some federal money in another school district that was quite poor with an extraordinarily high dropout rate to try to put all the children in a regime that a teacher had adopted, just one teacher, to have every year the ninth graders started with writing autobiographies, even if they were illiterate. Even if they couldn't spell four-letter words, they had to write the story of their lives, and then they had to write something every week. And all the studies then show that dropout were overwhelmingly concentrated among people who couldn't read well by the 8th grade. So the dropout rate in the school district literally dropped to zero when people, we all were interested in ourselves and our life stories. And they began to see that they had powers of self-expression, and they would be amplified if they could write well, read, spell, and all their other performance in math, everything else tended to increase. So anyway, we had good results. So then, I had the Department of Education send out a notice to all of our school districts, and we had about 300, saying that here was the results in this one school with collapsing the Title I funds and concentrating on highly individualized instruction at the beginning of school. And here were the experiences in reducing the dropout rate to zero with this writing program. And we would pay the expenses of every other school district in the state to go to these school districts and see what had been done and go home and implement it. That's the whole idea of America, right? The laboratories of democracy. And only 20% of the school districts did it. And that's when I became an advocate of charter schools. And so I say this to remind you not to take for granted the opportunities you have here and the commensurate responsibilities. When I started talking about this in New Hampshire, all my political advisors thought I had literally slipped a brain cell or two. They said, nobody knows what you're talking about. I said, oh yes they do. They may not know what a charter school is. They may not even understand what I'm saying, but they know we have to make the schools better, and that's what they want for their children and grandchildren. It is the right thing to do. And I said, there's no point in my being president if we're just going to do things the way they've always been done. Because America is going to do it. So, as you heard what Peter said, we started out with enough funds to help people organize 1,000 charter schools. And then by the time I left, we had enough funds to support the creation of 2,000, maybe a few more had been totally funded with no help from the federal government. And I was fighting a measure in California to put a lid on the number of charter schools. I had an unusual relationship with voters in California. They always voted for me, and then they voted against whatever position I took on every initiative. But they said, we love you, but we're still going to cut benefits to immigrants. We love you, but anyway, it was a great thing. I left in the budget, when I left office, enough money to do 3,000 charter schools, and as all of you know, because you're part of it, we now have nearly 6,000. And you've dealt with growing pains like everybody else. You've been criticized for creaming students, even though you have disproportionately high numbers of low-income students and minorities. And you've dealt with something I was always worried about, which is that the idea of a charter is that you have it for the period in which there is good performance, but it can be jerked, and so there's always criticism that the states don't hold the schools sufficiently accountable. The only thing I want to say about that is I think that you should continue to work on that, because here's where I see our country today with this whole economic crisis we're in. And why I'm so worried about the quality of the debate in Washington. One thing that every child ought to learn in school is if you may not always get the right answer. But if you ask the wrong question, you will always get the wrong answer. And so this whole thing's being pitched to us just as it has been intermittently, except for my 8 years in office and President Obama's 2 years. For 30 years, we've been told, except for those 10 years, that the government is always a problem. The government would mess up the two-car parade. If only we had less government, the world would be a wonderful place. Except when I need a college loan or my farm's going broke or there's a natural disaster. I want safe food or clean water.